Yeah, so again, Marc Brennan. Hello? Yes? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Wade Davis has said, "The world in which you were born is just one model of reality. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit." The purpose of my presentation is to discuss how conflicts are resolved in indigenous and traditional justice systems and tribal societies, and make recommendations for a new approach by Global North practitioners to alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. Lessons between systems and cross-fertilization can be good as long as the sharing is mutual and respectful. Especially in regard to traditional and indigenous groups, it's important for the ADR practitioner, and whoever hires or brings the person on board, to recognize that the other group exists and has value. There are a lot of different forms of alternative dispute resolution. Examples include negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and adjudication. People use other mechanisms for handling disputes at the local level, including peer pressure, gossip, ostracism, violence, public humiliation, witchcraft, spiritual healing, and fissioning of kin and residential groups. The dominant form of ADR originated in the U.S. and incorporates European American values. I call this Global North ADR to distinguish it from the Global South. Global North ADR practitioners frequently make assumptions of democracy. There is a liturgy of Global North-style ADR. It includes that mediators are neutral, that they're without decision-making authority, they're non-directive, they facilitate, they shouldn't offer solutions to the parties, they don't negotiate with the parties, they're impartial with respect to the outcome, and they have no conflict of interest. I would also add to this list that they usually work by ethical codes, they're trained and certificated, and they're supposed to maintain confidentiality. But a lot of ADR is done between groups with different cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. The practitioner must often struggle to keep the table level between the parties because there are often power differentials. One way to be sensitive to the needs of the parties is to use ADR methods that are based in traditional systems. But these systems have both pros and cons. They can be used to empower a party who normally has little power and to bring greater understanding to the dominant culture party. Some of these traditional systems have meaningful enforcement and monitoring methods. They're also respectful of the belief systems of the people involved. All societies need governance and dispute resolution forums. The traditional process is often generalized, as we've heard, as one of a respected leader or elder, facilitating, mediating, arbitrating, or building consensus. They resolve disputes between parties with the goal of being to right the relationships rather than to truth find or to determine guilt or liability. A reason to consider changes in the way many of us do ADR is the desire among some groups who call for the rejuvenation and reclamation of ways that disputes can be resolved according to the culture and custom of the indigenous party or local group. Indigenous and traditional systems can be more effective. The specific knowledge needed to adjudicate post-colonial and diaspora disputes militate against using a person who's an expert in ADR, but not in a particular religious or cultural domain. It is true that there are some people who do mediation who seem to be able to do everything. Most of us can't. I include diaspora disputes because they're immigrant cultures in the United States and Europe and elsewhere as well and refugee cultures and asylum seekers around the world. Now, there are a number of benefits of traditional systems of ADR as opposed to the Global North systems. They include being culturally familiar to the people involved, being relatively corruption-free. This is important because many countries, particularly in the Middle East, don't meet Global North standards in terms of the rule of law and anti-corruption. Other characteristics of traditional or indigenous ADR or mediation typically include quick resolution, the fact that they're inexpensive, they're locally accessible and resourced, they're enforceable if the community is intact, they're trusted by local people, they're frequently based on restorative justice rather than redistribution, and oriented toward preserving harmony within the community. They're usually conducted by community leaders who speak the local language, understand the local problems, and their rulings are likely to be accepted by the community at large. These local methods can include peacemaking circles, talking circles, family or community group conferencing, ritual healings, appointment of an elder or a wise person, a council of elders, and grassroots community courts, and many others, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Failing to adapt to the challenges of the local context is a common cause of failure in ADR when working with cultures outside the Global North. The values of decision makers, practitioners, and assessors undertaking a project will affect the decisions made and the perspective taken. Judgments about trade-offs between the differing needs of groups are linked to values. Practitioners should be aware of these tensions and articulate them, if only to themselves, at each step of the process. These tensions won't always be resolved, but can be reduced by acknowledging the role of values and working from the principles underpinning fairness in the particular given context. Culture expresses values. Although there are many approaches to fairness, four main factors generally encompass fairness: respect, neutrality, that is to say, being free from bias and interest, participation, and trustworthiness. And trustworthiness relates not so much to honesty or competence, but rather to the notion of an ethical carefulness. Opportunity is the idea that everyone deserves a fair chance to achieve his or her full potential. But in a number of traditional societies, women are excluded from opportunity. And this addresses the question we heard earlier about involvement of women in some of these processes. One of the problems with a number of these traditional and indigenous processes is that women are frequently left out. But bear in mind that even in the founding documents of the United States, we pretended that all men are created equal. But not even all whites were created equal in those founding documents, because women were excluded from many rights and benefits in addition to non-white people. Culture can be a code of behavior, as in the Afghanistani and Pakistani Pashtunwali, a code of behavior that has a profound existence in the collective mind of the tribe or the unit. It's seen as the unwritten constitution of the group. Cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals. It reflects the ability to acquire and use knowledge of these beliefs, attitudes, and practices. I maintain that ADR activities should be culturally based and influenced, that the values, traditions, and beliefs determine a person's and group's journey and unique pathway to peace and conflict resolution, rather than using a cookie-cutter approach that some Global North mediators use. The phrase we sometimes use is that they parachute in to a crisis and then take the first train out. Services should be culturally grounded and personalized. Ethnocentrism should be avoided. Culture should be added to ADR. The idea of relationships need to be expanded to include tribes and clans. When culture and history are left out or handled inexpertly, opportunities for ADR can be derailed and more problems can actually be created. The new role of the ADR practitioner, I think, is more of a facilitator, finding the right mechanism and the people. This new expanded role would require an almost intimate knowledge of the group's interactions, disputes, and other dynamics, as well as the ability and desire to intervene. There should be culturally appropriate dispute resolution training and programming for members of ADR, civil rights, human rights, and governmental entities that come in contact with various traditional, indigenous, and First Peoples groups. This training can be used as a catalyst to develop a dispute resolution program that's culturally relevant to the various respective communities. State human rights commissions, the federal government, the military, and other governmental groups, humanitarian groups, non-governmental organizations, and others that interact, whether we like it or not, for good or ill, may, if the project is successful, be able to adapt the principles and techniques for non-adversarial human rights problem solving along with other issues and along with other cultural communities. Now, these culturally appropriate methods of ADR are not universally and always good. They can pose ethical problems, lack of rights for women, they can be brutal, they can surrender to class or caste interest, and otherwise not meet international human rights standards. There may also be more than one traditional system in effect. In some places, there are 3 or more different systems all vying for primacy. The effectiveness of such mechanisms in affording access to rights is determined not only by cases won or lost, but also by the quality of the rulings handed down, the satisfaction these rulings afford to the applicant, and the restoration of harmony. Now, the global North ADR practitioner may not be comfortable with expressing spirituality. In the U.S., we are typically trained to keep religion out of the public venue. We're supposed to be neutral in our discourse. However, there is a strain of ADR that's informed by religiosity. An example is that of John Lederich, growing out of the Eastern Mennonite Church. The spiritual dimension of groups one works with sometimes needs to be ascertained. This is especially true for Native American and First Peoples groups like tribes and in the Middle East. The Zen Roshi De Son Nasakim said repeatedly, "Throw away all opinions, all likes and dislikes, and only keep in mind the mind that doesn't know." This is very important. Thank you.